The public humiliation and hook promise. Girls like you do not belong behind this door. Presley Vandermeer said it after Zahara Quince had already shown the official final selection invitation on her phone. The national system still listed Zahara as an approved finalist with the highest interview score in the group. Presley looked at the screen, took the printed door roster, crossed out Zahara's name with a black pen, and pushed the door nearly shut. A possible mistake had just become deliberate exclusion. Zahara did not raise her voice. "Are you removing me as chapter president?" "Yes." The ceremony was due to begin in less than 20 minutes. Under the porch roof, Lene Brooksford kept her camera recording. Presley did not know that Zahara was the daughter of Dr. Mavis Quince, chairwoman of the Alpha Viridian National Board. If the evidence reached national compliance before final selection ended, the ceremony could be stopped, chapter records preserved, and Presley Authority placed under immediate review. At 7:14 that Thursday evening, Rosemere Hall was already glowing behind tall front windows. Inside, the final candidates for Alpha Viridian Society were being checked against a printed roster before the last selection event of the semester. Outside, rain tapped across the stone steps. Zahara stood beneath the porch, holding her student identification card, the official invitation on her phone, and a slim folder of letters from high school girls she had mentored through college applications. A first-year member named Elise Harrow checked the paper list. "I am sorry, your name is not here." Zahara opened the national candidate portal. "My status still says final candidate." Elise studied the green confirmation. "Then this might be an old printout." A voice came from inside. "It is not." Presley Vandermeer walked to the doorway. As chapter president, Presley had spent recruitment speaking about tradition, excellence, and protecting Rosemere culture. Now she looked at Zahara's invitation, then at Zahara. "We reviewed the list again." "When?" "This afternoon." "Who approved the change?" "Chapter leadership." Zahara held up the phone. "The national system has not changed." Presley gave a small smile. "The national system does not run this house." Several candidates inside had begun watching. Bianca Ellery stood near the staircase. Her mother and grandmother had both been Alpha Viridian members, and her family had donated to Rosemere events for years. Zahara knew Bianca was a legacy candidate. She also knew her own evaluation score was higher. If final candidate status changed, the faculty advisor and national system should reflect it, Zahara said. Presley's expression tightened. "You have been here a few weeks and now you are explaining our process to me?" "I am asking which process removed my name." "The chapter decided you were not the right fit." Fit. A word vague enough to carry almost any decision without explaining it. "Which part of the evaluation did I fail?" "Not every quality can be reduced to a score." "Then what quality are we discussing?" Behind Presley, Corinne Veilhart held a clipboard against her chest. The vice president knew Zahara had not failed the evaluation. The previous night, Corinne had written beside Zahara's name that she was one of the strongest candidates Rosemere had seen. That afternoon, Presley had ordered a new door roster printed without her. Corinne had objected once. Presley answered with one instruction: protect the chapter culture. Now Corinne stayed silent. Presley stepped farther into the doorway. "This event is private. You need to leave. I received an official invitation. That invitation no longer represents the chapter decision. Then document the decision. Give me the rule used to remove me and who authorized it." Presley laughed. "You think this is an appeals hearing?" "No, I think a finalist should be told why she is being locked out." Rain blew beneath the porch roof and darkened one shoulder of Zahara's coat. Lene moved closer. She had come only to walk Zahara to Rosemere Hall and celebrate afterward. Now her phone was held low beside her bag, the camera aimed at the doorway. Presley noticed. "Are you recording?" Lene answered. "I am standing on a university walkway." "Turn it off." Zahara looked at her friend. "Do not interfere, just preserve what you already saw." Presley's face tightened. "This is exactly the problem." "What problem?" "The chapter needs women who understand what they are joining." "I understand the published standards." "Published standards are not the same as belonging." Zahara waited. Throughout recruitment, Presley had rarely used language anyone could challenge directly. She spoke about polish, family familiarity, social ease, and chapter image. Zahara asked again, "What makes me not belong?" Presley looked at her, then at Lene, then at the candidates watching through the doorway. Her voice dropped. "Girls like you do not belong behind this door." Nobody inside moved. Corinne lowered her eyes. Elise stared at Presley. Bianca stopped smiling. Lene's camera captured every word. The sentence hurt more than Zahara expected. She had completed every interview, every service round, and every leadership discussion. She had given Rosemere every chance to judge her by the standards it claimed to value. Now the real standard was standing in the doorway. Zahara took one slow breath. "Are you saying that as president of the Rosemere chapter?" Corinne finally spoke. "Presley." It was only her name, but it was a warning. Presley ignored it. "Yes, I am." Zahara nodded. "Then I want that statement attached to any review of my removal." "What review?" "The national review." Presley laughed openly. "You think the national board will investigate because one candidate did not get invited inside?" "I was invited." "Not anymore." Presley reached for the brass door handle. Zahara raised her phone. The green final candidate status was still visible. "Then make sure your version is the one the system shows." Presley looked at the screen. Her expression shifted. She had changed the printed roster at Rosemere Hall. The national finalist record still contained Zahara's name. Corinne stepped forward. "We should call Dr. Greaves before final selection starts." Dr. Opal Greaves was the faculty advisor responsible for chapter oversight. Presley did not want her involved until Zahara was gone. "The decision is made." "The national list is still active," Corinne said. "I said the decision is made." Presley pulled the door inward. Before it closed, Zahara said, "I am not asking for a favor. I am asking you to follow the process you already agreed to." Presley answered through the narrowing space. "Learn the difference between being impressive and being Viridian." The lock clicked. Zahara stood outside in the rain. Through the glass, the final candidates could still see her. A few turned away. Bianca did not. Lene stepped beside Zahara. "I have the whole thing." "Back it up." Lene saved the video to cloud storage and sent a second copy to her email. "What are you going to do?" Zahara looked down at the folder in her hand. Rain had reached one edge of the letters inside. Her first instinct was to call her mother. That was also why she hesitated. Dr. Mavis Quince had told Zahara something long before recruitment began. If you have to tell someone who your mother is before they treat you with dignity, the place has already failed. Zahara had entered Alpha Viridian recruitment without using Mavis' name for exactly that reason. No private recommendation, no phone call from national leadership, no inherited invitation. She wanted to know whether the organization meant what it printed beside the words sisterhood, service, leadership, and dignity. If Zahara used her mother name simply to get through the locked door, Presley could later claim the problem had been solved by privilege. Zahara wanted the opposite. She wanted the process to show what happened to a candidate when the chapter believed she had no power behind her. She opened the national portal again. Her finalist status was still active. She took a screenshot showing the time, 7:21. Then she photographed the printed notice beside the door. Her name was absent. Two records now contradicted each other. Lene looked at the screenshots.
She did this on purpose.
We know what she said. We still need to know who changed the roster. Even angry, Zahara refused to turn suspicion into proof. Her phone vibrated. A message from Karine appeared. "I am sorry." A second message followed. "Please do not leave campus yet." Then the second message disappeared. Karine had deleted it. Lene saw Zahara's expression. What happened? Karine sent something and removed it. Did you save it? No. Another signal. Not proof. But enough to suggest someone inside Rosemere Hall knew the decision could not survive scrutiny. At 7:25, Zahara called Dr. Opal Greaves. The faculty advisor answered on the fourth ring. "Zahara, I am at dinner. Is this urgent?" "I was locked out of final selection." A pause. "Presley told me there was a chapter fit concern. Was my final status officially changed?" "I have not checked the system. My portal still shows me as active." Dr. Greaves sounded tired. Chapters have discretion in membership decisions. Before final selection, after the national roster is confirmed, another pause. "I will speak with Presley. The event is beginning now. Will you tell them to pause until my status is verified? I am not stopping a chapter ceremony from my dining room over one disputed invitation." Zahara closed her eyes. Understood. She ended the call. Tomorrow would be too late. By then, the chapter could claim the final selection had already been completed. Lene asked, "Now what?" Zahara opened another contact. Maureen Sable, National Compliance Officer. Her mother had given her the number months earlier with one condition. Use the process. Do not use my office to skip it. Zahara looked through the glass door. Music had begun inside. Presley was moving forward. Zahara pressed the call button. "National Compliance, this is Maureen Sable. My name is Zahara Quince. I am an active final candidate at Rosemere chapter. I need to report a possible unauthorized removal from final selection." Maureen's voice became sharper. "Are you safe?" "Yes." "Do you have your current candidate status?" "Yes." "Evidence of the exclusion?" Zahara looked at Lene. "Yes." Maureen asked for the chapter, the time, and whether the faculty advisor had been contacted. Zahara answered each question. Then Maureen asked, "Has final selection begun?" Zahara listened to the music behind the locked door. "Yes." "Do not delete anything. Do not enter the house without authorization. I am sending you a secure upload address. Send the video, the roster image, and your candidate status." "What happens after that?" "If the records confirm that an active finalist was removed outside the approved process, I can request an immediate hold while the National Board is notified." For the first time that evening, the lock no longer felt like the final decision. Inside Rosemere Hall, Presley believed she had removed one uncomfortable candidate before the ceremony began. Outside, Zahara sent the evidence. The upload completed at 7:31. Seconds later, the National Compliance System generated a priority alert carrying the name Zahara Quince. And it was headed toward a board Presley never imagined was already connected to the woman she had left standing in the rain. The quiet endurance and hidden life. At 7:34, Maureen Sable opened the files Zahara had uploaded to National Compliance. She did not start with the video. She started with the system record. Zahara Quince was still marked as an active finalist. Her final round status had been confirmed that morning. There was no withdrawal, no disqualification, no faculty advisor approval removing her, no national amendment. Yet the photograph from Rosemere Hall showed a printed door roster without her name. Maureen checked the time attached to the candidate record, then the upload time. The contradiction existed before anyone at the national office had intervened. That mattered. She opened the video. Presley Vandermeer appeared in the doorway. The words were clear. "Girls like you do not belong behind this door." Maureen stopped the recording. She did not need to interpret the sentence yet. She needed to preserve it. At 7:37, she opened the Alpha Viridian after-hours compliance protocol and issued a temporary evidence hold on the Rosemere final selection records. It did not suspend the chapter. It did not declare discrimination. It did one thing. It prevented the chapter from quietly rewriting what had happened before a reviewer could see it. Inside Rosemere Hall, Zahara knew none of that. She was sitting alone in an empty campus study room 2 buildings away. Lene had gone to buy towels and hot tea. Zahara placed the folder of letters from the high school girls she mentored on the table. Rain had reached the bottom corner. She opened it carefully. The first letter came from a girl named Camille, who had nearly abandoned her college application because nobody in her family had attended university. Zahara had spent 3 evenings helping her organize financial aid forms and scholarship essays. Camille had written one sentence at the end. "Thank you for making the door feel like something I was allowed to knock on." Zahara stopped reading. For the first time since Presley locked Rosemere Hall, anger gave way to something worse: humiliation. She had spent weeks walking into that house believing the process meant something. She had answered questions about leadership, service, responsibility. She had listened while Presley spoke about women opening doors for other women. Now Zahara could still hear the lock. Part of her wanted to leave campus, not just Rosemere, the entire process. Let them keep their traditions. Let Presley choose people who already looked like the photographs on the walls. Let someone else fight over a sisterhood that could not recognize its own contradiction. Her phone rested beside the damp letters. Her mother name was one touch away. Zahara did not call. That choice had begun long before that evening. Dr. Mavis Quince had never raised Zahara to pretend the family had no influence. She had taught her something harder. Influence should never become permission to avoid the test everyone else had to survive. Mavis had joined Alpha Viridian decades earlier when she was one of only a few black women in her university chapter. She had entered with strong grades, campus leadership, and a service record that should have made belonging uncomplicated. It did not. At one alumni event, a guest handed her an empty glass and asked where the servers were supposed to place used dishes. During another year, she was moved away from the center of a chapter photograph because an alumna said the arrangement looked more traditional that way. A member once introduced Mavis as the chapter diversity pledge. Not Mavis, not the student who had earned the highest service evaluation that semester. The diversity pledge. Mavis told Zahara those stories without asking for pity. What bothered her most was not one insult. It was how easily everyone around it learned to call the insult something else. Preference, culture, presentation, tradition, fit. Years later, Mavis became an education attorney and eventually joined the national leadership of Alpha Viridian. She helped rewrite recruitment standards so local chapters could not formally exclude candidates on race, family status, income, or legacy connections. She pushed for recorded scoring criteria, appeal procedures, financial disclosure, national retention of finalist records. The reforms looked strong on paper. Rosemere was one of the chapters that claimed to follow them. But over the previous 3 years, complaints had begun reaching the national office. A Latina candidate reported being removed after a final interview despite strong scores. A black member said she had been told her natural hair did not match the chapter composite image. A first-generation candidate described being asked what her parents did for a living, even though family occupation was not part of the approved interview rubric. A scholarship member reported being pressured to buy an expensive formal dress after telling chapter leadership she could not afford it. Each complaint had been explained away locally: miscommunication, personality conflict, voluntary withdrawal, dress expectation, culture fit. None alone had been enough to prove a chapter-wide pattern. Mavis had refused to punish Rosemere based on rumor. She had also refused to forget the complaints. Then Zahara decided to rush Alpha Viridian. Mavis had objected at first, not because she disliked the organization, because she knew exactly what people would say if Zahara succeeded. Chairwoman daughter, guaranteed invitation, protected candidate. Zahara had made the decision simple: do not tell them. Mavis looked at her across the kitchen table. You understand what that means. Yes, if somebody treats you unfairly, I will not call a chapter president because you are my daughter. I know. If you join on your record. That is what I want. Mavis had studied her for a long moment. Then she agreed. Only the National Legal Office and the small group responsible for conflict disclosures knew Zahara was her daughter. Presley Vandermeer was not told. Dr. Opal Greaves was not told. The recruitment committee was not told. Zahara did not use her mother's surname as leverage because there was no different surname to use. Quince was simply her name. Most people knew the chairwoman as Dr. Mavis Quince. Few college students at Rosemere had ever looked closely enough at national leadership biographies to connect her with a sophomore candidate from the public policy program. Presley had certainly never asked. During the first recruitment round, Zahara spoke about the mentoring program she had created for girls from 3 public high schools near campus. During the service round, she proposed that Rosemere members spend fewer weekends planning image campaigns and more weekends helping students complete scholarship applications. Some members loved the idea. Presley smiled during the presentation. Afterward, she told Corinne something different. She is impressive, but she makes everything sound political. Corinne asked what was political about college mentoring. Presley changed the word. Too intense. By the leadership interview, Zahara was scoring near the top of the candidate pool. Dr. Opal Greaves gave her one of the strongest faculty evaluations. Corinne wrote that Zahara could strengthen the chapter. Bianca Ellery, the legacy candidate Presley preferred, remained competitive but ranked lower. That was when Presley began using another word: fit. At first, it appeared in conversation, then in leadership notes. Zahara has strong credentials, but we need to consider chapter fit. Nobody defined what fit meant. That was why it worked so well. At 7:41 that evening, Maureen Sable searched the National Complaint Archive for Rosemere. 4 previous files appeared. She opened them beside Zahara Current Report. For the first time, the language lined up in one place. Not polished enough. Not comfortable with chapter culture. May struggle socially. Not the right fit. Maureen did not call it discrimination. Not yet. She created a related case flag. Then she sent the preserved video and candidate record to the National Board chairwoman under the emergency notification rule. Mavis was at home when the alert reached her tablet. She saw the chapter first, Rosemere, then the candidate name, Zahara Quince. Her hand stopped above the screen. For several seconds, she was not chairwoman. She was a mother imagining her daughter outside a locked house in the rain. Then she opened the evidence. She watched the video once. She did not watch it twice. Mavis called Maureen. Maureen answered immediately. I was about to call you. Has the candidate been verified as active? Yes. Was there an approved removal? None in the national system. Has Rosemere been told who she is? not by compliance.
Keep it that way. Maureen paused. Mavis, she is your daughter.
I know.
Do you want to recuse from the first review?
From the factual verification, yes.
You handle it. And if emergency board authority becomes necessary, then call the vice chair and legal counsel with me. I will disclose the relationship before any vote. Maureen understood. Mavis was not trying to hide the conflict. She was trying to prevent the relationship from becoming the evidence. What do you want done tonight? Mavis looked at the frozen image of Zahara standing outside Rosemere Hall.
Exactly what we would do if her mother worked at a grocery store. Verify the record, preserve the messages, protect the candidate. Then tell me whether the chapter violated its own rules. After the call, Mavis sat alone. On a shelf across the room was an old Alpha Viridian photograph. She was 20 years old in it. The photograph had been taken after the year when someone tried to move her away from the center of the group. In this later picture, Mavis had chosen her own place, front row. Not because she wanted attention, because she had learned what happened when people who controlled the picture also controlled who was remembered. Her phone lit again. This time it was Zahara. Mavis answered. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Zahara said, I reported it through compliance. I know. Did you receive it because you are chairwoman? Yes. Zahara looked toward the dark window of the study room. I did not call you first. I know that too. Her voice almost broke. Mavis heard it. Do you want me to come as your mother? Zahara closed her eyes. Yes. Then she looked at Camille's letter on the table. Not yet. Mavis waited. Zahara continued, If you walk in there only because I am your daughter, Presley learns to fear the right family. She does not learn to follow the rule. Mavis said nothing. I want the record checked first. All right. And if they broke it? Then I will not be coming only as your mother. Zahara opened her eyes. What does that mean? It means Rosemere already had complaints before tonight. Zahara went still. How many? Enough that your report cannot be treated as an isolated argument at a door. Mavis stopped there. She would not turn unresolved complaints into facts for her daughter. You did the right thing by preserving what happened. What happens now? Compliance verifies the local roster against the national record. Then, if there is enough basis, they can stop the selection and preserve chapter communications. Zahara looked at the clock. 7:48. The ceremony was still happening. Are they going to get there in time? Mavis answered carefully. That depends on what Rosemere does next. Inside Rosemere Hall, Presley was already deciding. Corinne stood beside the selection table while Presley opened the candidate minutes on a chapter laptop. What are you doing? Corinne asked. Documenting the final list. The final list was already documented. Presley looked at her. Not locally. Corinne watched Presley type beside Zahara name. Removed following leadership review of chapter compatibility. Corinne felt her stomach tighten. When did we hold that review? Presley stopped typing. We discussed her. You told me you wanted her off the list. That was the review. That is not what the minutes say. Presley lowered her voice. Be careful, Corinne. About what? About turning a difficult membership decision into something bigger because you are uncomfortable. Corinne looked toward the front door. She had been uncomfortable when Presley crossed Zahara's name off the roster. She had been uncomfortable when the door closed. She had been uncomfortable when Zahara was left outside. Until that moment, Corinne had told herself that discomfort was not the same as responsibility. Now, Presley was asking her to let a new record replace what had actually happened. Corinne reached for her phone. Presley noticed. Who are you texting? Nobody. Put it away. Corinne did, but not before taking one photograph of the laptop screen.
At 7:52, the National Compliance Hold reached Rosemere chapter email. Presley opened it. Her face changed. Temporary preservation notice. Final selection records, scoring sheets, local rosters, leadership communications, and candidate status changes were not to be altered pending verification. Corinne looked at the text Presley had just entered. Presley looked at it too. For the first time that evening, the locked door was no longer the most dangerous thing she had done. The escalation and abuse of power. Presley Vandermeer read the preservation notice twice. Then she looked at the local minutes she had just changed. National Compliance had ordered Rosemere Hall to preserve every final selection record, local roster, scoring sheet, leadership message, and candidate status change from that evening. No deletion, no editing, no replacement. Final selection was on hold until the status of one active finalist could be verified. Presley closed the laptop. "This is routine." Corinne Veilhard said nothing. "It does not mean anything." The notice said otherwise. At 7:56, Maureen Sable called Rosemere Hall. "This is Presley Vandermeer, chapter president." "Maureen Sable, National Compliance."
Stop final selection.
"We already made the membership decision." The national system still lists Zahara Quince as an active finalist. "Chapter leadership removed her." "Who approved that removal?" "We did." "That is not what I asked." Presley stepped away from the others. "Rosemere has chapter discretion. Not to alter a confirmed finalist after the national list is locked without the required approval." Presley stopped. Maureen continued. "Do not change the minutes. Do not replace the roster. Do not delete leadership messages." "What exactly did Zahara tell you?" "That is not relevant to your preservation duty." "She is turning rejection into discrimination." Maureen entered the sentence into her notes. "I have not made that finding." "Then why stop the ceremony?" "Because your local roster contradicts the official candidate record." Presley glanced toward Corinne. "She was removed for fit." "Show me the approved definition of fit." Presley had none. The call ended. She turned on Corinne. "You contacted them." "No. If you are undermining chapter leadership, think carefully about what that means for your position." Corinne looked at her. "Are you threatening me?" "I am reminding you that officers protect the chapter." "From what?" Presley did not answer. Across campus, Zahara received the same update from Maureen. "Final selection has been placed on temporary hold. Please remain available." She stared at the message. The chapter had been forced to stop before choosing around her. It was not justice. It was not membership. But the locked door was no longer the final word. Lene Brooksford returned to the study room after transferring the original video file to compliance. "They want us back at Rosemere." Zahara put the letters from the girls she mentored into her folder. Lene looked at her. "You do not have to go back." "I know." "Then why are you going?" "Because I asked them to review what happened. I cannot disappear when the review starts." At 8:17, 3 vehicles stopped outside Rosemere Hall. Maureen arrived with National Legal Counsel. The vice chair of the National Board came under the emergency review procedure. Dr. Mavis Quince arrived separately after formally disclosing her relationship to the reporting candidate. Dr. Opal Greaves reached the foyer moments later. Presley met her before anyone else entered. "This is being blown out of proportion." Opal looked at the printed roster. "Did you remove Zahara after the national finalist list was locked?" "We reviewed her fit." "Did I approve a finalist change?" "You knew I had concerns." "That is not approval." Only an hour earlier, Opal had been willing to treat the issue as chapter discretion. Now she was looking at a formal national hold and a roster she had never approved. The front bell rang. Corinne opened the door. Maureen entered first and showed her national compliance credential.
Final selection remains suspended.
Presley forced a smile. We understand. Maureen held out her hand. The door roster. Corinne gave it to her. Maureen compared it with the national candidate system. Sahara existed in one record. She had vanished from the other. Who printed this version? Chapter leadership. Maureen looked at the footer. The print account is assigned to the President office. Presley corrected herself. I printed it after our review. When was the review? This afternoon. Who attended? Corinne and I. Maureen turned. Miss Veilhart, was there a formal vote to remove Zahara Quince? Corinne looked at Presley. No. Presley stiffened. We discussed her. You told me she did not fit chapter culture. I told you there was no documented reason to remove her. The words left Corinne before fear could pull them back. Maureen recorded the statement. Presley stepped forward. That is not the full context. You will have time to provide context. Then Maureen asked for the chapter laptop. Presley did not move. The records are private. They are subject to the preservation notice. We have confidential candidate information. National Legal Counsel is present. The review will be limited to relevant records. Presley looked toward Opal. The faculty advisor did not rescue her. Give them the laptop, Opal said. Presley handed it over. Maureen opened the local selection minutes. Beside Zahara's name was the entry Presley had typed before the hold arrived. Removed following leadership review of chapter compatibility. Maureen checked the document history. The entry had been created after Zahara was locked outside. Was this written during the afternoon review? Presley saw the timestamp. No,
I was documenting an earlier decision.
After the candidate challenged it? I was completing the minutes. Then the creation time will be preserved with the entry. Presley folded her arms. You are making normal chapter administration sound sinister. Maureen closed the laptop. I have not characterized it. That answer frustrated Presley more than an accusation would have. A preserved sequence did not need an adjective. The front door opened again. Zahara entered with Lene beside her. Maureen had authorized her presence as the reporting candidate. Presley stared at her. You brought all of this here? Zahara answered quietly. I asked you to follow the process at the door. Then Dr. Mavis Quince entered. Opal recognized her immediately. Dr. Quince. Presley had seen that name on national reports and annual membership updates. She had quoted Mavis in speeches about sisterhood. She had never connected the name to Zahara.
Dr. Quince, we were not told you were coming.
Mavis looked toward Maureen. Has my disclosure been recorded? Yes, the vice chair is handling factual board decisions tonight. Presley frowned. What disclosure? Maureen answered. Dr. Quince disclosed a personal relationship with the reporting candidate before any board action was taken. Presley looked at Zahara, then Mavis. Quince. The meaning arrived all at once. She is your daughter? Yes. The foyer went silent. Corinne stared at Zahara. Opal lowered her eyes. Bianca Ellery stopped halfway down the staircase. Presley recovered first. If I had known that, I would have handled tonight differently. The expression on Mavis's face hardened. Do not finish that thought. Presley stopped. My daughter entered this process as an eligible candidate. You were not told about me because you were not supposed to treat her differently. Presley turned toward Zahara. You knew you had national board power behind you. I knew I had the right to report a process violation. This was a trap. No, Mavis said. There were concerns about Rosemere before tonight. I refused to treat concerns as facts without evidence. Presley's face tightened. What concerns? Maureen stepped in. Those are outside tonight's initial verification. The boundary mattered. Mavis was not allowed to turn old complaints into proof simply because her daughter had been hurt. Maureen returned to the local record. Tonight, we are verifying candidate status, the roster change, and the conduct at the door. Presley pointed toward Lene. So the video is your case? No. Maureen opened the national candidate file. This is the primary selection record. Zahara remained an approved finalist. Her interview score ranked first. Her service score ranked first. There was no withdrawal, no disciplinary mark, no approved removal. Maureen placed the printed door roster beside the screen. Zahara's name was missing. The video supports what happened at the door. The national system establishes that she was still a finalist when you locked her out. Presley looked at Opal. We have membership discretion. Inside the authorized selection process, Maureen said, not through an undocumented removal before it. Presley changed direction. Scores do not guarantee membership. Correct. For a moment, she seemed relieved. Then Maureen continued. But they do establish that Zahara did not fail the recorded evaluation. Bianca Ellery stepped forward. I need to say something. Presley cut her off. Bianca, not now. Maureen looked at her. What did you want to say? Bianca hesitated. I knew my score was lower than Zahara's score. Presley stared at her. You do not understand the full scoring structure. I saw the ranking yesterday. That was preliminary. Zahara was still first. Bianca's voice was quiet. She was not accusing Presley of discrimination. She was admitting that the candidate who benefited most from Zahara's removal knew she had not earned the higher position on the recorded scores. Maureen added the statement to the file. Presley looked around the foyer. Every route she tried to use was narrowing. Then she pointed toward Corinne. Tell them we discussed fit. Corinne went pale. Maureen watched her. Presley's voice sharpened. Think very carefully. Corinne flinched. Maureen intervened. President Vandermeer, do not pressure a witness during a compliance review. I am reminding her to be accurate. Accuracy will come from the preserved record. Corinne reached for her phone. There is a leadership group. Presley stared at her. What are you doing? Corinne did not answer Presley. She looked at Maureen. Some of the discussion happened there. Do not delete it, Maureen said. You do not need to surrender your personal device tonight. We will preserve the relevant messages through the approved process. Presley looked toward legal counsel. This is a private group. Counsel answered. Private does not mean exempt from a preservation notice when the messages concern the decision under review. For the first time, Presley looked genuinely afraid. At 8:43, Maureen issued a formal order. Rosemere final selection was suspended for the night. The candidate roster was locked. No final membership decision could be issued until the integrity of the finalist list was established. Presley stared at her. You are canceling our ceremony because of Zahara? No. Maureen closed the tablet. I am suspending a process because the chapter cannot currently prove that its own finalist roster is valid. Only an hour earlier, Presley had stood behind the front door, deciding who belonged inside. Now she could not complete the ceremony. Zahara watched without smiling. Her mother had not ordered Presley removed. The National Board had not declared the case finished. The record had only reached the point where Presley could no longer control it alone. That was enough for one night. But Corinne's phone still held the leadership messages from before Zahara arrived, and one of them had been sent directly by Presley. Do not let ZQ in tonight. She will make the room uncomfortable. Part 4. The pattern behind the door. At 9:15 the next morning, Rosemere Hall was no longer running recruitment. It was preserving evidence. Maureen Sable returned with national compliance staff and a written audit authorization covering the previous 3 recruitment cycles. Dr. Opal Greaves arrived from the university. Corinne Veilhard had been instructed not to discuss testimony with Presley Vandermeer. Presley entered carrying a binder. She had also changed her explanation. This was never about race, she said. It was about chapter culture. Maureen set the binder aside. We will get to your explanation. First, we are preserving the leadership messages Corinne identified. The export came from the chapter archive, with sender names, timestamps, and surrounding conversation. The first relevant exchange was from 2 weeks before final selection. A committee member wrote that Zahara Quince had scored exceptionally well in the service round. Presley replied that Zahara was impressive but might not understand Rosemere heritage. Corinne asked what that meant. Presley answered that some women understood the house naturally, while others wanted the house to change around them. Maureen looked up. Where is that measured in the approved rubric? It is not written that way. Then where was it scored? It was leadership judgment. Maureen recorded the phrase. The next exchange followed Zahara's proposal to expand mentoring into nearby public high schools. Presley wrote that Zahara would turn every event into activism. Another officer asked whether that was a problem. Presley answered that Rosemere needed women who could represent the chapter without making everything about inequality. 3 days before final selection, Corinne wrote that Zahara ranked first overall. Presley replied, "Scores are a guide. Leadership still protects the room." Maureen asked, "Protects the room from what?" "From a group that does not function together." Did Zahara violate conduct standards? No. Did she fail any recorded category? No. Did she mistreat another candidate? No. Presley paused. Membership cannot be reduced to numbers. Correct, Maureen said. But discretion cannot replace an approved standard with an undisclosed one. Then the message appeared. Bianca is safer for tradition. Presley interrupted. Bianca is a legacy. Her family understands Alpha Viridian. Was legacy status an approved scoring category? No. Could it increase her score? Officially, no. Then why did it matter? Presley looked toward Opal. Continuity. Maureen asked Opal, "Is continuity an authorized finalist criterion?" No. Presley's jaw tightened. Tradition, continuity, fit, culture. The words sounded respectable. None appeared in the scoring policy she was supposed to follow. The archive moved to the afternoon before the ceremony. Corinne had written that Zahara could not be removed without advisor confirmation because the national finalists list was locked. Presley answered, "I am president. Handle the door." The room went quiet. Maureen asked, "When you wrote that, did you know Zahara was still a confirmed finalist?" "Yes." "Did Dr. Greaves approve her removal?" "No." "Did National Compliance approve it?" "No." "Then why did you order the door enforced?" Local leadership still had responsibility for the chapter. Corinne finally spoke. There was no leadership decision. Presley turned. "We discussed her. There was no vote." "Corinne, I told you we had no documented reason to remove her." Presley's expression hardened. "You agreed there were concerns." "I agreed to discuss them. I did not agree to erase her name." Maureen let the silence hold. Then she asked Corinne the harder question. "Why did you stay silent at the door?" Corinne looked down. "Because I was afraid of losing my position." "What made you believe that could happen?" Corinne produced an older email from Presley. After Corinne questioned another recruitment decision 2 months earlier, Presley had written that officers who could not support chapter unity might need to reconsider whether leadership was the right place for them. Corinne swallowed. I told myself staying close to the decisions meant I could make them less unfair. Her voice lowered. But Zahara was outside, and I stayed inside. Nobody excused her. Fear explained her silence. It did not erase the result.
Maureen asked whether she would provide a signed statement and answer questions in the expanded audit.
Yes, Presley laughed once. So now you save yourself by blaming me. Corinne looked at her. No, I am telling them what I did, too. Across campus, Zahara sat with Lene Brooksford in the Public Policy Library. The folder containing letters from the girls she mentored lay beside her. Lene checked her phone. Still nothing. They said the audit would take time. Zahara tried to read, then closed the book. I keep thinking about everyone who stood inside that house. Corinne? Corinne was afraid. Bianca benefited. Dr. Greaves ignored warnings. Presley made the decision. Lene watched her. You are separating them. They are different failures. Zahara touched the damp edge of Camille's letter. If everybody becomes the same villain, nobody has to answer for the exact thing they chose. At 11:10, Maureen received the first national comparison from 3 previous recruitment cycles. It was not a final finding. It showed where the audit had to look. Candidates without legacy connections were removed at the last discretionary stage more often than legacy candidates with similar or lower recorded scores. The difference was stronger among scholarship and first-generation candidates. Maureen opened the first historical case. Sophia Calder had reached the final round 3 years earlier with one of the strongest interview scores in her group. Rosemary's closure record said she withdrew because of scheduling concerns. An archived message from Sophia said otherwise. I did not withdraw. I was told I would not be comfortable in the house. Opal stared at the message. I never saw that. Who had access to the recruitment inbox? Maureen asked.
Chapter officers and the faculty advisor.
Did you review it? Not regularly. Why? I trusted officers to elevate serious complaints. Maureen moved to the second file. Nia Holloway, a black member, had reported being told her natural hair did not fit the visual consistency of the annual composite photograph. Rosemary closed the complaint as a misunderstanding about photography guidelines. National policy contained no hair standard. A third file involved a first-generation candidate whose interview notes recorded her parents' occupations and whether her family belonged to a private club. Those questions were prohibited. Presley interrupted. Different years, different officers. None of that proves I discriminated against Zahara. They are not being used to prove Zahara's case, Maureen said. She closed the individual file. The national finalist record, altered roster, leadership messages, and door video already establish what happened to Zahara. Presley went still. Maureen opened the historical review. These records determine whether Rosemary repeatedly used words like fit, polish, and tradition to produce the same kind of exclusion. The question had changed. The audit no longer needed another piece of evidence saying Zahara had been wronged. It needed to determine how many other women had faced the same unwritten rule. At noon, Bianca Ellery arrived voluntarily. She was not under investigation. I asked to speak, she told Maureen. Presley stared at her. Bianca sat. My mother and grandmother were Alpha Viridian members. I always knew that helped me socially. Did anyone promise you selection? No. She hesitated. But Presley told me not to worry about Zahara. Presley cut in. What exactly did I say? That Rosemere knew how to protect its traditions. That was not a promise. I know. Bianca looked at Maureen. I heard it as reassurance because I wanted to. Her statement did not make her innocent of benefiting from the system. It established something narrower. Legacy status had been used as reassurance, even though national rules said it could not outrank merit-based evaluation. At 12:40, Maureen opened one more preserved record. 10 months earlier, after screenshots of recruitment discussions began circulating, Presley had written to officers, "Clean the old recruitment chatter. We do not need jokes becoming policies because someone screenshots them." "Did you send this?" Maureen asked. "Yes." What did clean mean? "Remove irrelevant conversation." Corinne spoke carefully. "Some recruitment messages disappeared afterward." Presley snapped. "You cannot prove I deleted anything." "Nobody said you personally deleted them," Maureen replied. Presley stopped. "But the instruction is relevant to preservation risk." National Legal Counsel issued a retention request for available communication metadata. No one pretended a missing message would prove the whole case. The point was different. If chapter leaders had controlled what survived after complaints, Rosemere could no longer be allowed to investigate itself. Opal looked at the growing file. For years, she had considered each complaint separately. A candidate said she had been pushed out. A member said her appearance had been criticized. A scholarship student said money became a barrier. Opal had repeatedly asked whether one incident alone proved deliberate discrimination. Usually it did not. She had never compared the pattern. Maureen turned to her. "The university will need to review your oversight role separately." Opal nodded. "I understand." Presley looked at her. "You signed the closure reports too." "Yes." "Because there was no proof." Opal looked at the files. "No, I signed them because I treated chapter explanations as if they were proof." Presley said nothing. Opal continued. "Corinne was afraid of losing a position. Those candidates were afraid nobody would believe them. I was afraid national intervention would damage the chapter." She looked toward Maureen. Every fear protected the institution, except theirs. At 1:30, the Emergency Review Committee reconvened. Mavis Quince did not vote. Her relationship to Zahara remained formally disclosed. The vice chair led the decision. Maureen presented only what had been established. Zahara's local roster entry had been removed without required approval. Presley knew the national finalist status remained active. She instructed officers to keep Zahara outside. Leadership messages relied on fit, tradition, and legacy status outside the approved rubric. Historical complaints showed enough similarity to require a full audit. The committee did not issue final discipline. It changed authority. Rosemere's current recruitment leadership could no longer control the unfinished final selection or the investigation. Presley was temporarily barred from changing candidate records, contacting rejected candidates about the audit, directing witnesses, or conducting another membership vote. The chapter itself was not yet suspended. Presley was not expelled. Those decisions required completed findings, but the key had changed hands. Maureen gave Presley the written restriction. Presley read it slowly. All of this because one candidate did not get through a door? Maureen placed the historical files beside the order. No, because we finally checked how many times Rosemere may have closed the same door for the same kind of reason. Outside Rosemere Hall, Zahara received the interim decision on her phone. Lene watched her read. Presley lost recruitment control. For now. Does that feel good? Zahara looked at Camille's letter. No. Then what does it feel like? Necessary. A second compliance message arrived. All finalists would be contacted within 24 hours. No one would receive membership until the independent review determined how the selection process had been affected. That included Zahara. No special invitation, no shortcut. Exactly what she had wanted from the beginning.
But now another choice waited for her. If Rosemere rebuilt the process, Zahara would have to decide whether she wanted the repaired door opened for herself at all. The systematic reckoning, legacy, and moral aftermath. By 9 the next morning, Rosemere Hall had lost the one thing Presley Vandermeer had treated as permanent: control. The National Board Emergency Committee met with Maureen Sable, University Counsel, Dr. Opal Greaves, and the Vice Chair. Mavis Quince attended only for portions that did not require a vote involving Zahara. The first decision concerned recruitment. Rosemere could not complete final selection under its current leadership. The second concerned Presley. Her temporary restriction became a formal suspension from chapter office while the full audit continued. She could not represent Rosemere to candidates or alumni, access recruitment records, contact witnesses about the investigation, or preside over membership decisions. Presley listened from the end of the conference table. "You are destroying an entire chapter over one bad night." Maureen answered, "The order is based on more than one night. The old complaints were never proven. Some were never investigated well enough to be proven or disproven." Presley looked toward Opal. "You signed those closures." Opal nodded. "I did." "Then say something." "I should not have signed 2 of them without independent review." Presley stared at her. That was not the rescue she expected. The committee also ordered the current finalists to return through a corrected process. The scoring rubric would be visible. Legacy status would not be shown to interviewers. No Rosemere officer involved in the disputed selection would score the new final round. Candidates would have an appeal channel outside the chapter. Membership costs would be disclosed before anyone accepted an invitation. Those changes did not make Zahara a member. They made the next decision hers. After the meeting, Maureen asked Zahara to remain. Mavis stayed in the hallway while the vice chair closed the door. "We can offer you an immediate provisional invitation," the vice chair said. Zahara looked at her. "Why?" "Your exclusion was unauthorized. We do not want the correction to cause further harm." "Would the other finalists receive one?" "No, they would return through the corrected process." For a few seconds, the offer felt like relief. No more interviews. No more walking back into the same house. No more giving people who had already judged her another chance to decide. Then Zahara thought of Camille, the high school student whose letter was still in her folder. "Thank you for making the door feel like something I was allowed to knock on. If I accept this, what does Rosemere learn?" The vice chair waited. "That locking me out was wrong because my mother sits on the national board?" "No." "That is what it will look like." Maureen leaned forward. "What do you want?" The final process again. "You understand there is no guaranteed invitation." "I never asked for one." The vice chair studied her. "You are certain?" Zahara nodded. "My mother taught me that the right door is not one that opens because somebody important recognizes your name. It is one that follows the same rule when nobody important is watching." The provisional invitation was withdrawn at Zahara's request. When she stepped into the hallway, Mavis was waiting. "They offered you something." Zahara smiled slightly. "You can always tell." "What did you say?" "No." Mavis did not ask why. She already knew. The expanded audit took 6 weeks. Investigators compared 3 years of finalist scores with final outcomes. They reviewed approved rubrics, local notes, financial expectations, complaint closures, archived chapter messages, and interviews with former candidates. Not every complaint was sustained. That mattered. The National Board did not convert suspicion into guilt simply because Presley had already violated the rules in Zahara's case. But a pattern survived review. Legacy candidates with lower scores had repeatedly survived the final discretionary stage. Several scholarship students had been marked down for polish or social readiness, even though neither term had an approved definition. 2 candidates described being asked about their parents' occupations. Sophia Calder confirmed she had not voluntarily withdrawn. Nia Holloway confirmed the comment about her natural hair before the composite photograph. The finding was not that every Rosemere member shared the same prejudice.
It was that the process allowed prejudice to hide inside words nobody was required to define. Fit, polish, tradition, culture.
Presley received the final disciplinary findings in the dining room, where she had once decided who would enter Rosemere. Maureen placed the document before her. The audit found that Presley knowingly removed an eligible finalist from the local roster without required approval. She instructed officers to enforce that removal while knowing Zahara remained active in the national system. She relied on unauthorized concepts such as chapter fit and legacy continuity. She pressured Corinne during an active review, and an earlier message directing officers to clean recruitment chatter justified stronger preservation controls when complaints arose. The audit did not claim Presley personally caused every historical failure. Her own decisions were enough. Presley read the last page. What happens now? You are removed as Rosemere chapter president. Presley did not move. You are ineligible for chapter office for the remainder of your undergraduate membership. What about Rosemere? Recruitment privileges remain suspended until the reform plan is implemented and independently verified. So, everyone pays. No, Maureen said. Everyone becomes responsible for repairing a process leadership allowed to fail. Presley turned toward Zahara, who had been invited for the portion addressing the current recruitment cycle. I apologized. Zahara said nothing. Presley tried again. If I had known who your mother was, I would never have let this happen. Zahara held her gaze. That is why the apology does not solve it. Presley frowned. If my mother were not chairwoman, you would still think the door was yours to close. Presley opened her mouth. Zahara continued. You did not need more information about me. You needed a rule you were willing to follow for everyone. Then she stopped. There was nothing else she wanted from Presley. No humiliation. No public begging. No revenge. The consequence belonged to the record. Corinne faced her own review. She retained membership but was removed from recruitment duties until she completed governance training and cooperated with the reform process. When Maureen asked why anyone should trust her with future leadership, Corinne did not defend herself. They should not trust me, because I finally spoke after the damage was done. She took a breath. If I earn trust again, it should be because I speak before the door closes next time. Her statement did not erase her silence. It gave her something harder than forgiveness, a standard she would have to meet. Dr. Opal Greaves also faced a university finding for inadequate oversight. She was not removed from the university, but Rosemere complaints could no longer be controlled by a single faculty advisor. Future complaints would be copied to the Student Organization Office and National Compliance. Opal was required to revisit older closures she had approved. During the first review, Sophia Calder joined by video. Opal looked at her. I treated your complaint like a disagreement, instead of asking why the chapter record contradicted you. Sophia answered, I needed that question 3 years ago. Opal nodded. I know. Nobody called the moment forgiveness. It was accountability arriving late. Rosemere spent the rest of the semester rebuilding recruitment. Fit disappeared from evaluation. So did polish. Legacy status disappeared from scoring materials. Interviewers could not ask about parents' occupations, private clubs, donations, or alumni connections. Required costs had to be disclosed before membership acceptance, and the chapter created assistance for members who could not afford required clothing or additional fees.
Finalist scores were stored nationally before local voting. Any later change required a documented reason visible outside the chapter. An independent observer would attend the final selection stage. Corinne helped build the new appeal form. Bianca Ellery joined the Financial Access Committee. At the first meeting, Bianca admitted something she had avoided during recruitment. I benefited from a system I never had to question because it kept opening for me. Nobody applauded. That was not the point. She continued, "If legacy status cannot officially help me, then it should not quietly help me either." 8 weeks after the night in the rain, the corrected final selection began. Zahara returned to Rosemere Hall carrying the same folder of mentoring letters. The water-damaged corner was still visible. Lene walked with her to the porch. "Want me to bring the camera?" Zahara looked at the door. "No." "You sure?" "I want to know what they do when nobody is expecting a scandal." At the entrance, a national observer checked Zahara against the digital finalist list. Her name was there. No second sheet existed.
No one asked who her mother was. Inside, every candidate received the same question set. Scores were entered independently. Interviewers could not see legacy status. When Zahara spoke about her mentoring program, she did not soften it to make Rosemere comfortable. "I still think sisterhood should make a young woman stronger than she was when she entered." One interviewer asked, "What if the institution itself is what makes her weaker?" Zahara thought about the locked door. "Then loyalty means repairing it, not pretending it is fine." 2 days later, Zahara received the result through the national system Presley had tried to ignore. Invitation approved. She stared at the screen. Mavis sat across from her at the kitchen table. "Are you going to accept?" Zahara laughed softly. "You really are going to make me decide everything myself." "I have been trying." Zahara looked at Camille's letter beside the laptop. Then she clicked accept. Not because Rosemere had finally allowed her through the door, because the door now had rules that did not depend on who stood outside it. 1 year later, Rosemere Hall held its new member service night. The old paper roster was gone. Financial assistance information sat beside the membership packet instead of appearing after acceptance. The mentoring program Zahara had proposed during recruitment was now a permanent chapter project. 24 high school girls filled the main room for an evening on college applications, scholarships, and public service. Mavis sat in the back row, not on the stage, not introduced as chairwoman. She was there as Zahara's mother. Near the end of the event, a 16-year-old girl waited until the others moved toward dinner. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." The girl glanced around Rosemere Hall. "Do you ever feel like places like this were built for somebody else?" Zahara looked toward the front door. For a moment, she could see the rain again. Presley in the doorway, Corinne looking down, her name missing from the paper list. Then she looked at the room as it was now. The answer was not that every institution deserved trust. Rosemere had needed evidence, accountability, and change. Zahara handed the girl a mentoring folder. "You do not belong because somebody at a door decides you look right." The girl listened. "You belong where the values are real enough to apply to you, too." Beside the entrance was a new plaque. It did not carry Mavis Quince's name. Zahara had asked for the rule instead. Sisterhood is not a door for the chosen few. It is a promise to open the way. After the last student left, Mavis stood beside her daughter. "When I was your age, I thought changing an institution meant getting enough power to make better decisions than the people before me. What changed? I learned that better power is still dangerous if nobody can question it." Zahara smiled. "That would make a very long plaque." Mavis laughed. They walked toward the door together. A year earlier, Presley Vandermeer had believed a pen, a paper roster, and a locked door were enough to decide who belonged. The records proved otherwise. But Zahara's victory was not that the chairwoman of the National Board was her mother.
If that had been enough, the story would have ended the moment Mavis arrived. Zahara chose something harder. She rejected the shortcut. She returned through the corrected process. And she made sure the next candidate would not need a powerful parent waiting behind her for the rules to matter. Zahara opened the front door. This time, it did not open because anyone finally understood who her mother was. It opened because Rosemere had finally been forced to understand who the rules were supposed to protect.